Bueno, buenos días. Bienvenidos a esta segunda sesión de este viernes, la última en esta bonita habitación que nos ha dejado el Museo del Romanticismo. Ya saben ustedes que la sesión de la tarde será en la residencia de estudiantes. ¿Problemas de sonido? Espera. Sí. A ver, ¿problemas técnicos? Sí, vale. Bueno, pues como la mayoría de como todas las presentaciones van a ser en inglés, me van a permitir que ya deje el español por este ratito y pasemos al inglés. Welcome to this afternoon session. It is my great pleasure to welcome our first speaker, Lynn Garafola. She is Professor Emerita of Dance at Columbia University, Barnard College. As you all know, she's a leading expert in Diaghilev's era. Her monograph on the ballet russe is a key text in dance studies. It has inspired many generations of dance scholars. But Lynn has also published many other books, collections, translations, such as the Diaries of Marius Petipa, writings on André Levinson, José Limón and Finis Memoirs, Rethinking the Sylph, etc. Her latest project is a much-awaited book on Bronislava Nijińska. Oxford University Press is already advertising it for June, so we can't wait to have it in our hands. But in the meanwhile, she's here with us today. Well, not here in Madrid, but online. We are very happy that she's sharing her thoughts on Anna Pavlova, La Argentina, and Katherine Dunham with us. So Lynn, welcome, and when you're ready.
Yes, I'm ready.
Great.
Well, good morning to everyone from New York, where it is still dark. But before beginning, I want to thank the Comité Científico for inviting me to present this material to the conference, although I'm doing it virtually. Long overshadowed by the rite of spring and now dogged by accusations of racism, Petrouchka left a deep mark on artists in search of new forms of dance theater. Produced by Diaghilev's Ballet Russe in 1911, the ballet had music by Stravinsky, choreography by Michel Fokine, and a fairground setting visualized by Alexandre Benoit. Petrouchka was set in 19th century St. Petersburg during the city's traditional Butterweek fair, a time of revelry during the lean months of Lent. Before the lean months of Lent. The ballet looked and sounded nothing like ballet as most people knew it. Modern in style and nationalist in expression, it offered a model for transforming popular traditions into the raw material of a high modernist art. Among the works it inspired were Alejo Carpentier and Amadeo Roldán's unrealized La Barabamba, depicting an Afro-Cuban carnival, Capora, an Argentine indigenous work, also unrealized, with designs by the painter Alfredo González Caraño, and a libretto by the writer Ricardo Giraldes, and the choral ballet Sagi, with a libretto by Alain Locke and music by William Grant Still, based on African folk materials. For enthusiasts of this new form of popular expression, a few of the enthusiasts of this new form of popular expression were dancers or choreographers. When Václav Nijiński visited Argentina in 1917 on tour with the Ballet Russe, his would-be collaborators begged him to choreograph their ballet. They knew the dances and the popular lore, but needed somebody to animate them. And that somebody had to be like them, a man. Except that in Buenos Aires and throughout most of Europe and the Americas, ballet meant legions of ballet girls in semi-undress or ballerinas in huge fluffy tutus. To all appearances, the dream of a muscular new dance of national identity was doomed because of its distaste on the part of male artists and writers for ballet's overwhelming perfume of femininity. Ironically, it would be women who rescued the dream of the popular as high modernist art. This paper will examine the efforts by, next slide, please. Anna Pavlova, next. La Argentina, next. And Katherine Dunham, to use folk and vernacular movement to create modernist narratives of national and cultural identity. Many connections existed between Pavlova and La Argentina. Both were divas, adored by the public, with La Argentina frequently referred to as the other Pavlova or the Pavlova of Spanish dance. Although considerably younger, Katherine Dunham shared many of the qualities that distinguished the other two. In Chicago, where she lived from 1928 until 1940, she saw La Argentina perform and even met her and studied with people who had danced for Pavlova. Like them both, she headed a company of her own creation, traveled to the world to accolades, and was a diva. This at a time when racial segregation was the rule in most walks of American life. Dunham's debt to La Argentina remains unacknowledged, yet the latter's repertory, mining folkloric, flamenco, and classical Spanish dance forms and performing them on a single program, may well have represented the idea of national identity as inspirational as the African diasporic identity that Dunham sought to embody. Both collected dances, Dunham in a more formal way as a trained anthropologist, but in their theatrical renderings of that material, both went to great lengths to dignify it, enhance it with music of quality, and prune it of demeaning stereotypes, especially those associated with popular entertainment. And both claimed a place for their art on the concert stage or in legitimate theaters or opera houses, even if they sometimes played music halls and nightclubs. By now, we may seem a long way from Petrouchka, but in the three women who are the focus of this paper, one finds a similar approach to folk and vernacular movement, the same respect for the popular source, and the same sensitivity in stylizing it for theatrical presentation. Finally, one encounters a similar aspirational intent, a desire to give cultural standing to dances perceived as having little cultural value. Ultimately, all three sought to construct national, racial, and cultural identities through vibrant evocations of the dancing body. The flower of the Mariinsky's last pre-revolutionary generation, Pavlova exemplified the traditional image of the ballerina. Next slide, please. But she was also a rebel who flung convention to the winds, donned sandals and tunics a la Isadora, and gave herself over to the suggestion of bacchanalian delights. In September 1923, when she returned to Covent Garden after her first extended tour of South and East Asia, the season included the ballerina's first efforts to introduce European audiences to authentic Asian dance styles. By contrast with the exotica of older ballets, Ajanta's frescoes and Oriental impressions incorporated genuine elements of Indian and Japanese dance vocabulary learned through observation of practicing theater artists and firsthand acquaintance with the artistic patrimony of the civilizations that had nurtured them. In India, many had expressed the hope that Pavlova would produce an Indian ballet. Such a ballet, she told a reporter from the Times of India, would have to be, quote, built up on the art of the Indian peoples, notice the use of the plural, their methods of presenting a dramatic story, their folk dances, and their music. Next, please. Okay, skip that. That was from an earlier version of the paper, which I've cut. However, it was not until she discovered the Ajanta frescoes, which you see here, and accidentally witnessed a Hindu wedding in Bombay that she felt she had material for a ballet. In fact, there was little opportunity for someone like Pavlova to witness Indian dance firsthand. According to Indian dance scholar Joan Erdman, quote, for the few dancers who traveled to India and sought indigenous dance forms, the showy street dances of the Kataks, the rarely approachable tribal and village festival dances, the inaccessible temple dancers designated as prostitutes, and the absence of opera and staged dance performances left foreign visitors with only fragmentary information, end quote. In London, Harcourt Algeranov, he was one of Pavlova's English dancers, was dispatched to the Victoria and Albert Museum to do costume research. He attended a recital of Indian music by Komalata Banerjee, whom Pavlova quickly engaged to compose the music. Banerjee, in turn, introduced Pavlova to a young Indian dancer who was studying painting. This was Uday Shankar. Next, please. Pavlova invited Shankar to join her in creating two ballets, A Hindu Wedding and Krishna and Radha. For the first, he drew on memories of a wedding in Rajasthan. For the second, he created a sequence of decorative poses and movements. The costumes were based on Indian miniatures and made from fabric that Pavlova had brought from India, while Banerjee's music, based on traditional forms, was played by an orchestra of Western instruments. Algeranov was especially taken with Krishna and Radha. Here he wrote, quote, Pavlova was all submission, and Shankar, handsome, masculine, and graceful, was indeed Krishna, the eternal lover, end quote. Although the observer responded warmly to these Indian-inspired scenes, they fared poorly with other critics. C.K. Scott Moncrief, better known as the English language translator of Proust, had nothing but scorn for Ajanta frescoes and its audience, which included a number of non-whites. And although critics waxed on about Pavlova in other roles, and they passed over her, quote, tender and submissive Radha, as if by donning Indian dress and outlining her eyes in kohl, she had abandoned whiteness. Nor was there any mention of Shankar, who was a real Indian and a very handsome one at that, not only authenticated the Indianness of the episode, but also embodied the subaltern interracial desire that exclusionary laws throughout the British Empire were intended to suppress. Although Pavlova stood at the head of a company, critics often referred to her as a soloist. Next, please. This star soloist was even truer of Argentina. Born in 1890 in Buenos Aires, she grew up in Madrid, where she danced at the Teatro Real before embarking on a music hall career. By the time she went to Paris in 1910, Argentina was an accomplished artist. For Emery, writing in the theatrical newspaper Comedia, her debut at the Moulin Rouge was sensational. Quote, tomorrow, this marvelous Argentina will be one of our idols, he predicted. The outbreak of World War I found Argentina an artistic crossroads. In Madrid, she attended the premiere of El Amor Brujo, which she would later produce as a hugely successful ballet. She renewed contact with Spanish artists and intellectuals and began the process of transforming her repertory, adding new musical voices and recasting her music hall turns as concert dances. In New York, where she gave solo performances at the Maxine Elliott Theater, in addition to appearing at social events, her program found a select and appreciative audience. But after a second concert, she returned to the variety stage as a Palace Theater headliner and a star attraction on the Keith vaudeville circuit. Argentina's stay in New York coincided with the Ballet Russe seasons at the Metropolitan Opera and a long Pavlova engagement at the Hippodrome. Although Argentina was certainly acquainted with the Ballet Russe in Europe, it may have been in New York that she took a closer look at the company's stagecraft and repertory, which combined nationalism with an increasingly modernist sensibility. With Stravinsky's Firebird and Petrouchka in the New York repertory, along with Midnight Sun. Next slide, please. That's Larionov's design for Midnight Sun. Now, this was another Russian-themed folkloric ballet. The season could be seen as a model for Argentina's Ballet Español. Next slide, please. Thanks to Madame, quote, thanks to Madame Argentina, announced Femina in 1927. Femina was a women's magazine. We will have a season of Spanish dances, of Spanish ballets presented as artistically as the Russian ones. A more immediate model for Argentina was Pavlova. In August 1916, her company began a long run of the Sleeping Beauty at the huge New York Hippodrome, where every day 5,000 people saw a truncated version of Petipa's ballet dressed by Leon Bakst. It is hard to imagine that Argentina didn't see Pavlova either in the Sleeping Beauty or in one of the mixed bills that replaced it in November. Moreover, Pavlova's image was ubiquitous. And it cannot have been lost on Argentina that the Pavlova organization, unlike Diaghilev's, was female-led and female-centered. Next, please. Like Pavlova, Argentina entered imaginatively into each of her dances, infusing them with emotional and romantic and mimetic expressiveness. Quote, she surrounds every number with an atmosphere of her own, provides it with character and climax. John Martin commented after Argentina's first wildly successful New York recitals in 1928. He was impressed by the effortlessness of her movement, the, quote, genius of her theatrical skill, the way her carefully planned dances were always, quote, fresh and alive, and the joy she conveyed in performing them. During her last great US tours, Argentina touched the hearts of Depression-era Americans with her portraits of rollicking peasants, fish vendors, gypsies, characters from all over Spain, as well as its former empire, with their music and their dances. In his numerous writings on Argentina, André Levinson, the Russian-born dean of French critics of the 1920s, I should say dean of French dance critics of the 1920s, viewed her as a living incarnation of Spain and its art. It was not simply that she had regenerated a dance long cheapened by, quote, music hall gypsies, but because, quote, in her, the spirit of the Occident triumphs over the lure of the Orient. She has once more reconquered Andalusia from the Arabs, end quote. Argentina never espoused this proto-fascist cosmography. Her Spain was inclusive, a big tent that welcomed losers as well as winners. Rather than reenacting the battle of Christians and Moors, her art celebrated the diversity of Spain, its intermingled peoples and their dances. She had fought for the dignity of those dances, for their right to be respected and celebrated for their beauty. A nationalist in art, Argentina was a Democrat in defining her body politics. Next, please. Among the crowds at Chicago's Studebaker Theater, where most of Argentina's concerts took place in the 1930s, was the aspiring young dancer Katherine Dunham. Dunham was African-American, born in 1909 and raised in Joliet, Illinois, and a student of anthropology. In high school, she joined the Terpsichorean Club, where she discovered the enchantment of, quote, pink satin slippers and wild Russian hopaks, the era's twin faces of ballet. But it was only when Dunham followed her brother to the University of Chicago and joined the racially integrated Little Theater, known as the Cube, that she could even contemplate becoming a ballet dancer. In the 1920s and 30s, segregation barred most African Americans from studying ballet and modern dance, even in the North. However, at the Cube, Dunham found several mentors, including Mark Turbyfill, a ballet dancer who agreed to teach Dunham and a small group of Black students. Sorry. But when classes began, Turbyfill discovered it was hard to rent studio space once landlords realized the dancers were Black, and even harder to raise money for an all-Black ballet company. Dunham, meanwhile, immersed in the atmosphere of the Chicago Black Renaissance, had moved beyond the enchantment of pink satin slippers. As Turbyfill wrote in November 1930, quote, we are not suggesting that the darker ballerina confine herself to the ballet of Pavlova. We would merely place at her disposal the technique which would enable her to express her own individuality and the genius of her race, end quote. Next, please. Guiding Dunham through this transition was the Russian-born dancer-actress Lyudmila Sperantseva. More of a character dancer than a classical one, she had also studied modern dance in Germany with Mary Bigman. In the early 1930s, Sperantseva became instrumental in Dunham's growth as an artist and in her creation of a language that fused ballet, modern, and character dance styles within a framework of theatricality. In 1932, the two women established the Negro Dance Art Studio and under its aegis, a new company, which they called The Modern Dancers. Dunham and Sperantseva were the New Enterprises manager directors, with Sperantseva also director of choreography and, quote, instructor in modern and Spanish dance. The modern dancers made their debut in December 1932, dancing a ballet to a prize-winning score by the Black composer Florence B. Price. Quote, the modern dancers, wrote the Chicago Defender, are beginning a new era in the history of the race dancer. Next, please. In Chicago's interracial bohemian artistic milieu, Dunham found both a home and a group of women who cushioned the racism of the larger society. She worked with the former Pavlova dancer Ruth Page, who hired her for a minor role in La Guiabes, then gave her own starring one to Dunham. Major touring attractions passed through Chicago, and Dunham saw them all. Performances by Colonel de Bazille's Ballet Russe, including Petrouchka, and the Mortgen Ballet, including Giselle, recitals by L'Argentina, Escudero, and Harold Kreutzberg, and many of the touring artists dropped by the Negro Dance Art Studio to teach. Those were my impressionable years, Dunham later wrote, and whole new vistas were opening. I was starry-eyed. In searching for what her own body could do and for what might, quote, develop out of Black people, she told an interviewer in the 1970s, people like L'Argentina and Kreutzberg and Mary Wigman gave me a great deal of hope. Next, please. Thus, even before she went to the Caribbean in 1935, Dunham had developed a considerable repertory of world dances. Carmencita Romero, née Lily Mae Butler, who began studying with Dunham in the early 1930s, recalled her creating dances based on the cultural traditions of Cuba, Brazil, Russia, Spain, and Native Americans before she even left the country. Lagia, Dunham's first ballet set in the Caribbean, revealed the fusion of these early influences, a love triangle inspired by Giselle, but embedded in a folk atmosphere like Petrouchka. It included the stately Creole mazurka, or mazouk, the uninhibited beguine, the Cuban habanera, and the Martinican agia, a male fighting dance. The work showcased Dunham's theatrical and choreographic gifts, as well as her ability to present folkloric material without stereotyping it. The history of 20th century ballet has traditionally been written as a narrative of choreography and the organizations that both promoted and fomented it. With only a few exceptions, this choreo-institutional history gives pride of place to the men who created the vast number of works and served as teachers, ballet masters, and company directors, rather than to the women who brought those works to life. It is a view that all but negates the many ensembles headed by women, including the companies of Anna Pavlova, L'Argentina, Branislava Nijinsky, and Ida Rubinstein, and discounts choreography by women realized on other stages. By effacing this women's world, it also effaces the connections among its practitioners and the ideologies they pursued, which departed in significant ways from the master choreo-institutional narrative. Shedding light on this submerged history is one of the goals of this paper. Anna Pavlova, L'Argentina, and Katherine Dunham are all well known, and each has been the subject of a body of scholarship. But generally speaking, they have not been viewed as belonging to a succession. Yet each built in some way upon the earlier artist's achievement, leading companies, tending their public image, and dignifying material that lay outside a narrowly conceived classical norm. Each, moreover, took a broad view of, quote, world dance, treating this as a means of conveying both a national and an international identity. Pavlova's development of this repertory was the most traditional. However, it was her celebration of subaltern dance forms and their fusion with traditional ballet practices that prompted a reevaluation of national dances in India, even if it was left to others, including her protege Uday Shankar, to bring that reassessment to fruition. With L'Argentina, the transformation from a technically accomplished dancer of the review stage to an artist whose repertory embraced all of Spain was also gradual. It too involved shedding the past. In her case, a theatrical system predicated on the exploitation of Españolada stereotypes. By the time Dunham attended her performances, L'Argentina was dancing exclusively in concert halls and legitimate theaters, using music by Spain's leading modern composers. Moreover, Argentina's vision of a, quote, refined Spanish dance offered a model for Dunham in approaching African diasporic material with a model for Dunham in approaching African diasporic material. Finally, through Dunham's ability to fuse African diasporic material with concert techniques, ballet dramaturgy, and a modern sensibility, she created an African-American art dance for the concert stage. Petrouchka expanded the notion of ballet to incorporate vernacular and folk material, academic idioms, and free movement. More than any other work in the Diaghilev repertory, it was both local and universal, its popular echoes speaking to Petersburgers in the audience and its broader themes to others. Like the dances brought into being by Anna Pavlova, Argentina, and Katherine Dunham, Petrouchka suggested how a ballet, a quote ballet, could take many forms and convey ideas about identity and style that had nothing to do either with Russia or the danse d'école. And those who chose to explore the possibilities the ballet opened were women working outside the early 20th century's choreo-institutional complex. Gracias.
So thank you very much, Lynn, for this, for such an interesting, this is interesting connection and a lineage, you know, between three major female dancers and choreographers and of the 20th century. We have covered with time. Good. I can take a couple of questions, maybe. Any questions for Lynn? Maybe the chat? Is there anything in the chat?
I didn't really look, but maybe. No?
No, nothing? Okay. Oh, sorry? Rachel, you might go. Please, go ahead. Rachel.
Good morning, Lynn. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's fascinating. I was wondering, given that you're working on this project with these three distinctive choreographers, female, how would you expand your thesis in terms of their lineage? What other areas of connection are you thinking about between them?
Well, first of all, this is less than half of what I actually wrote. Okay. It was a little over time. But I would, of course, in the case of Pavlova, what was cut out was something she did in terms of Mexico, in terms of this sort of mestizo ballet. It wasn't a mestizo. She did took a popular Mexican dance, performed it, wearing a chino poblana skirt and a huge sombrero and embroidered blouse, but danced this traditional Mexican folk dance in point shoes. And for many, for scholars, as well as for many, this is in 1919, before what takes place in Asia. This is really considered the beginning of ballet in Mexico, even though, of course, there was ballet in the 19th century, but somehow this image, which was so close to one might call the ideology of the post-revolutionary period in Mexico, this mestizo cultural moment, that this becomes the beginning of Mexican dance. I also cut out all the stuff about other forms. I would like to do a little bit more work. I would like to include something on El Amor Brujo that I feel in many ways was you saw the same mixing and inclusion of multiple forms that you find in both Petrouchka and in in Dunham's Lagya. And so I would like to do a little more work on those. Now, of course, Dunham didn't see Lagya, didn't see El Amor Brujo. She actually used a little piece of the music for a dance that she choreographed, but she never saw it because this was not brought to the United States by La Argentina. But she certainly could have heard about it from Speranceva and from others whom she met, and she could have read about it, you know, so all of that. But I think the idea of this soloist who embodied so many parts of an identity, inhabited it through dances, is something that that Dunham very much gravitated to. And again, I would perhaps add a little bit more about Ruth Page, who was another important influence in Chicago, and of course was the choreographer of La Guillabesse, which one could also argue, and I know Joellen Meglin is in the audience somewhere, that La Guillabesse was also in some measure a model for Lagya. So I would expand on some of the artistic specifics. I would also, you know, begin to think perhaps of expanding this to other choreographers, but I wanted to weed out people like Nijinsky in something like this, because Nijinsky, you know, had all kinds of identity problems and ran into this problem when she was working with the Polish ballet, because the dances that she had, her notion of Polish folk dances were not considered to be Polish enough. And they were considered Russified, et cetera, et cetera. There's also the question of someone like the Littlefields, who had companies in the 1930s and early 1940s. So I would like to keep it, though, with this idea that there were ways of exploring identity within this opening that happened with the Ballet Russe, which offered any number of paradigms for ballet that had not previously existed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Tiziana, please go ahead.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for your paper. It's very, very important, because I think concerning Anna Pavlova, really we have to read it now in a new way, as you are doing, because she was so much fond of what was called later on like ethnic dance. It was so important for her career. She was very curious wherever she was going.
Yes.
To really, and she disseminated ballet or whatever. I mean, really over the world. I think no other dancer, no other company went all over the continents. So I think that this is very, very, very important. And she was dancing in opera house, very prestigious, but also very simple theater. Sometimes I think this aspect of Anna Pavlova should be underlined. And I want to just say that soon will be coming a publication in Spanish edited by Eva Fernandez del Campo, and there are a number of contributions. Irene Lopez is also contributing. I'm contributing, speaking about Anna Pavlova in India and the effect of on the revival.
Yes.
So the publication is in Spanish. Soon should be come out. There will be soon also an English translation of it. And I think that, as you said, it's really, we have to do research on this, because the image of Anna Pavlova as only ballet, but she was, as you said correctly, so fond of avant-garde. But unfortunately, for a question of money also, of economical, she could not express, because the audience want her with the Dying Swan, with all this, but she was very fond of exploring, doing this sort of experimentation. And I think that could be interesting, even though it's not this volume in Spanish that is going to come out. Which
well, I do read Spanish. I read Spanish. So
yeah, oh, fine. That is great, because it's also explore a number of artists that they were in India at the time, amongst also American, that Ruth Sendenis and then Lameri. So it's interesting to see how this choreographer went to India, how much they took, what they got inspired, how. So it's interesting, this interaction, these connected histories, actually.
Yes, yes.
So
I was reading something quite interesting that Pavlova had said to Algeranov. Algeranov was an interesting English guy. He wrote a very interesting memoir. He became very taken with Japanese art and really studied, I mean, a whole thing. He studied very diligently when they were in Japan with one of the important kabuki actors and his wife. But he said that Pavlova and he were one day at a performance. This must have been in the mid-1920s. And they were doing some kind of Spanish dance. And she looked at him and she said, you know, after seeing the kind of Spanish dance that we have seen, meaning very great Spanish dance, to see this is awful. So that Pavlova herself, in the years, you know, from the girl, the young, very young ballerina of 1907, who made her first tour abroad, to the mature ballerina of the mid-1920s, she had changed tremendously. She had grown intellectually in a way that we don't give her credit for. We expect her to be, in a sense, frozen into that tutu for the dying swan. You know?
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think that if there are no more questions, yes, there's one. That's the final one, because we're going a bit ahead, a bit behind schedule. So just one more, Lynn.
Thank you so much, Lynn. My name is Juan. I've been in contact with a student of Algeranov, and she lives in Australia. And she remembers Algeranov before he had the fatal accident on the motorcycle, when he unfortunately then passed away. But she was attending his classes, and Algeranov showed pieces from Pavlova's repertoire very vividly. Of course, Algeranov also worked with Mona Inglesby in the International Ballet, and he then went to Australia. So I'm very interested in seeing if we can rediscover certain elements of her repertoire, not only of course the films that were done in Hollywood, but also then for The Immortal Swan that came out in the 30s after her death, but to see if there's any people in connection to her legacy, because we usually talk about Pavlova as this stunning, and she was stunning and beautiful, ballerina and artist. But where is the heritage? You know, it's a bit like with Isadora Duncan. Where is her heritage? You know, if you know any relation to that.
Well, I would say in terms of film, something that was put together by the dance division of the New York Public Library, I think is very helpful. It's when she did this, when she was in the United States during the First World War, she worked with this opera, Max Rabinoff, and this Boston Opera Company. It was touring, but she did a production, they did a production of a film of La Muette du Portici and The Dumb Girl of Porticcio, it's called in English. And it has her as a, you know, as the dumb girl on the mute girl dancing on the streets near the beaches of Naples, and as an actress, and she's marvelous. And you can really see what a remarkable, how she was able to invest herself into all kinds of movement. And then on the other hand, it shows her as a Duncan-esque dancer, kind of Duncan-esque ballet, floating through space with all kinds of an attempt at almost magical transformation scenes. So I think that gives a sense of her personality in a way that others don't. It may even be available on the internet because it was done with public monies. As for the other things, it's really hard to say because she died in 1931, and that first generation sort of scattered. I think there has been a certain amount in the United States written about Muriel Stewart, who worked with her and then became a very influential teacher, also a choreographer, although that's usually not spoken about. And she worked for many, many years at the School of American Ballet. And people spoke about the way she would try to tell them about breathing, about the flow of movement, things that certainly came from Pavlova. But I would like to say something, add one little footnote to something I recently discovered, which has to do with this. I've been investigating some early African-American ballet dancers, very early, and trying to figure out where they learned ballets. And I truly stumbled across a program from Fisk University, which was an all-Black university in Tennessee, and what turned out to be a student production by a young woman with her choreography of the magic flute. This was not the magic flute we know of Mozart, but the magic flute that was done at the Mariinsky. That was a role that, it was a ballet that Pavlova had danced. She then set it on her own company, and it was danced throughout much of the 1920s. And so here is this African-American young woman who very possibly in the mid-1920s had never studied with a Russian teacher who was trying to was producing this ballet or some version of this ballet for a group of Black women students at Fisk University in Tennessee. And I think that's a fascinating bit of lore, if you will, but about the way things cross. They just don't go along their proper paths. They escape and they go into interesting other directions.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a fascinating discussion that we could go on and on, but we have limited time. So thank you very much, Lynn, for joining us today. It was our pleasure to have you with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.